I'd like to start by acknowledging country and pay respect to traditional owners on the lands on which we're meeting today, and respect to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here in the room and in the virtual world. So yeah, thank you. And also thank the Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network for having me here today. I'm going to talk about a bit of a campaign we've got at the moment, and there's sort of two parts to it, both sort of trying to drive the same thing. One is restoring flows to the Upper Murrumbidgee River, and in that sort of sense we've come up with a bit of a campaign called the Forgotten River. And so I'm going to run through a presentation now that talks about why we've called it the Forgotten River, some of the reasons we've thought that's an appropriate name, but also go through my experience in working in some of my previous roles with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office, and how what I've learned in those other parts of the basin apply upstream or don't apply upstream. So I should have said, my name's Andy Lowes and I'm with the Australian River Restoration Centre since about February this year, and prior to that at the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and before that the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office. And I'll start with this photo here. This is Point Hut Crossing, just downstream of Point Hut, which is right near where I live. I live in Gordon, and this is sort of the closest point to where I live, and so I walk down here sort of pretty often. Now this photo was taken on the resumption of flows after it ceased to flow in 2020, so these were sort of the first flushing flows after that, and you can still see a few of the rocks there are still pretty dry because they haven't been under, but I dare say since then they've been pretty wet. We've had a good couple of wet years back to back, and certainly more on the way this in the next couple of days. Now in those two roles, a key focus for me was delivering water for the environment, or environmental water. Same thing, different name, but it's about returning water back to the river systems and trying to reinstate some of these natural seasonal flows that the river system is used to. And so when I talk about where we were delivering water for the environment, big releases out of the Goulburn River, big releases down the Murray, the Murrumbidgee downstream of Burrinjuck and Blowering, and in the Lower Darling. And we'd do it for the river systems themselves, as well as these iconic sites along the river. So the big forested sites of Barmamillowa, Kundruk Paracuta, down to the sort of semi-arid floodplain lake systems of Hatter Lakes, Chowla, all the way to the Murray mouth. And I guess there's a lot of things we've learnt from doing that. You know, we've been doing this for a long time on a large scale, delivering water for local outcomes and also system-wide outcomes, so from top to bottom. And one of the other benefits I've had of working in these roles is engaging with different communities right down the river and having those same conversations that I'm only now starting to realise and recognise back here, about people saying, geez, we used to see a lot more of these fish. Geez, we used to see a lot more of these, you know, turtles, platypus, freshwater mussels, and sort of starting to make that connection. Hang on, that's me as well in my own patch. So I'll sort of keep coming back to that in a sec, but this is a nice sort of connection of a map showing how all the rivers connect. But I'll go to the next slide, please, and show you how it kind of looks when you're talking about delivering water and how a modified river system looks. So this is the same sort of southern Murray-Darling Basin, but you can see it's now got all the added storages in, all the locks and weirs, the sort of major irrigation areas. You see locks down in South Australia, locks 1 to 11, 15, 26. The reason why there's 15 and then 26 is because they were originally going to build 16, 17, 18, and then as sort of rail came online and it became easier to move things, they weren't relying on the river system as much to transport goods, but sort of a bit lucky they didn't whack those extra 10 or so locks in. But you can see what a really modified river system looks like. And so when I'm talking about delivering these large environmental water releases, we're using it from Goulburn Weir, Eildon, Hume, Lake Mulwala, downstream of Burrinjuck, downstream of Blowering, out of Menindee Lakes, and also Lake Victoria, down near the South Australian border there. Now, there's really 4 key things that allow us to do some really good stuff on a large scale here, and they're really important for the Upper Murrumbidgee because they're things that we don't have. The first one is having a substantial amount of environmental water. So an amount of environmental water where you can make a difference year after year and start to reinstate some of those winter-spring flows. The second one of those is once that water is released, in these other parts of the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, that water is protected. So that water can't be taken out, it's there for the environment and it stays there for the environment. The third one is a rule called carryover, and that's where the way the water system works is on an annual basis. So you have what's called a water year that runs about the same as a financial year. And carryover allows us to make a decision to go, do we need to use all the water this year or are we better off saving some for next year? And that's, you think of things like end of financial year sales where you try and get everything out the door. That means we don't have to rush to push things out. We can make a decision to go, hang on, let's hold this water over for next year because it might be heading into drier conditions. And that's a really useful tool to have. And the fourth one is being able to adaptively manage it throughout the year. So be able to work with the river operators and say, look, we'd like to do this kind of flow in spring, up to this amount, but if conditions change, having the flexibility to either increase or decrease depending on how the season unfolds. So if it starts to get really wet, you don't want to lock in plans that you had 6 months ago. So being able to change throughout the year and work with the operators to make those decisions is a really useful tool to get the best use of the water that we have. I'll just, the next click please, because that'll just bring up so I'll just grab a quick swig. Excuse me. So for the last best part of 10 years, my focus has been the rest of the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. And then now all of a sudden I'm turning my attention to this upstream patch where these rules don't apply. And so I've seen how the rest of the system has moved on and is starting to try and learn what's the best way we can look after our rivers, but it doesn't apply up here. And I didn't really know this until really recently. And so now, after I feel like I've put so much effort into trying to help other parts of the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. Over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, I've really turned my attention to this, particularly the Upper Murrumbidgee. But lessons that apply up here also apply to the Snowy and the other sort of montane rivers as well. I think the final point I was going to make on this slide is all these things that are happening elsewhere that aren't currently up here aren't really scheduled to change unless we ask for it to be changed. And that's where groups like the Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network, the Demonstration Reach, a whole range, Southern ACT Catchment Group, everyone is trying to push to say, hang on, we should be able to do better up in this part of the world, but it won't happen unless we keep asking for these kinds of changes. I'll go to the next slide, please. But this is what really drew my attention to it. This was the first time when I went, hang on a sec, my focus hasn't been in my own backyard. I don't really understand how this river works. And so I changed from going out to communities in the other parts of the basin and trying to explain how it works to then becoming a community member trying to work how the hell everything works. Who operates the dams? What are the rules around it? What's the flexibility? And how does this happen? Because my understanding of the rest of the Southern Murray-Darling Basin is that this shouldn't really happen. There should be minimum base flows, water to allow conveyance water, so some basic flows in the river to move water from one site to the next, but also protection of flows for what they call critical human water needs, drinking water, accessible water from the river. And when this happened, Tharwa had to have water brought in. So this was really the first time for me where I went, hang on, I haven't been paying attention at all in my own sort of backyard. And that shifted my focus. So that was the end of 2019. It's wet as anything at the moment and probably going to be wet for the next, 6, 12 months. But we need to prepare for the next dry. And that's why I'm going to keep showing these kinds of photos. I think we'll go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so as I started to try and go, well, hang on, how did the river dry out, and started to chat to people in the local networks, A couple of key events I think really helped me understand what's going on. One was the Fish and Flows Forum, and I'm not sure how many people made it down to that down at the Murrumbidgee Centre. And that was last year. And then the second one was the Water Quality and Security Forum that was run by Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network earlier this year. And the videos for that are still online, and I do reckon if there's two you want to go back and look at, the one about the climate change impacts, given by I think Janice Taylor from the Bureau of Meteorology, gave a real sense of what climate change could mean for the headwaters of the Murrumbidgee River. And the second one is probably Paul Doyle's snowy hydro explanation, and I probably need to go back to that myself and remind myself how it works, because it's a pretty complicated area to understand. But a couple of things that I picked up from this. The first one from the Fish and Flows Forum were things like silver perch now being considered locally extinct, golden perch missing major age cohorts in its population, concerns for Murray crayfish, turtles, platypus, and all the other fauna that rely on a healthy river system. And also probably the Macquarie perch story that I didn't fully appreciate, that the Upper Murrumbidgee is home to such a significant population of Macquarie perch. And I think with the release of the State of the Environment report, last week or the week before, and the concern for loss of species, that for me I think elevates the need to care for this part of the world. Now the Water Quality and Security Forum, one thing for me that I didn't know again, and I'm trying to learn a lot in a short amount of time, is that the ACT actually relies on the Murrumbidgee as part of its drinking water supply planning. That after Cotter and after Googong, we have the Murrumbidgee to Googong pipeline, which is we're going to rely on in dry times. And when that happens, we're going to be hoping that the water in the river is of sufficient quantity and quality that we can actually provide our consumptive water. And so I think that forum raised that concerns about the regional security of water under the way it's currently operating, and also the water quality, so concerns around turbidity and bacteria. And I know the ACT government has raised those sort of water quality concerns amongst other networks as well. I might jump to the next slide, please. I might have covered all these, but I think these slides will be shared afterwards. So I just wanted to start to put some dot points down about things that I've, try to sum up what we're seeing here. Under the current management arrangements, we're seeing a continued decline of the ecology, impacts on the cultural significance, and also social impacts due to river closures, due to bacteria and things like that. Now, the water sharing plan for this part of the world has objectives for those things. It has environmental objectives, it has cultural objectives, it has social objectives. And I can't see how any of them, or almost all of them, are being met with the current arrangements that are in place. And I think those messages have been sent on the consultation at the moment on the water sharing plan from a range of groups, and I think it's important we keep recognising that. It's one thing to have a water sharing plan saying here's all the stuff we want to do, but if the flows can't do it, that we need to say that they just can't. It's nice to have objectives, but you need to have the flows to actually try and achieve them. I've already gone through sort of the concerns about the environmental water, not enough, not protected, and not managed with best practice. The governance is complex or complicated. It's a nightmare to get your head around. The sort of interjurisdictional relationships, the Snowy relationships, how Snowy operates. It's, I think being part of these networks, one of the best things is just to chat to each other and go, how does this work? Who does what? How can we get involved? But I think that also makes it hard for our politicians to understand as well. I even think they might struggle with the complexity around this part of the world. I've covered the sort of, well, I'll say it because I think it's important to say, but I think the current arrangements we have in place are a threat to our regional water security, our water quality, our critical human water needs, and can be a harm to human health, especially when we're seeing those bacteria loads in the river. And the final thing is that many of these issues have been documented over a period of time and are continuing to be documented. So I think we need to also keep pointing back to where these things have been picked up, and I'll touch on a couple of examples later on. I'll go through some of the recent work that we've done. So this is where connecting with groups such as this, with the Regional Catchment Coordination Group, University of Canberra, Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach, ANU and so many others, ACT and New South Wales governments, we're trying to collectively build this story to say, hang on, everything we've done to try and fix other parts of the Murray-Darling Basin are not being applied at all where we are, and there doesn't seem to be a clear avenue to drive that unless we push it ourselves. And that's why we've sort of come up with this idea of the Forgotten River, because it has been left behind by all water reforms that are intended to try and fix some of these things. Ahead of the election this year, we wrote to federal candidates and just gave them a bit of heads up on what we're cooking up, and pointed out some of the issues that we have. And I think there'll be some really key now elected members who we should really look to focus our attention. One of them is Senator David Pocock. I'm not sure if anybody follows his social media. I'm not big on social media, but he's almost down at the Murrumbidgee every week. You know, he's running, he's swimming in it, and he has been, talking about it since at least 2020. So he will be a really strong advocate, I think, for our part of the world. The other one is Katie Gallagher as the Finance Minister, and the reason why is because the Finance Minister is one of the shareholders in Snowy Hydro. So I'll come back to that as well in a moment, but as both a local and someone who can help influence, I think she'll be another really useful ally, potentially. Otherwise, we're happy to meet with Eden Monero members, ACT government members, and we have met with Shane Rattenbury. And I think it's a similar structure where Snowy Hydro has two shareholders who are federal ministers. I might even throw to the Icon Water guys at the end just to fact check me on this. But I understand Icon has two shareholders, and one is the Chief Minister and one is the Environment Minister. Thank you. And so Shane Rattenbury, I think, is interested in this because of that Murrumbidgee to Googong pipeline and that reliance that we're going to have on it in dry times for our critical water. Presented to this group at the last meeting and again today, and the Snowy Advisory Committee briefly. Made submissions to the New South Wales Regional Water Strategy. So we did that at the Australian River Restoration Centre, as well as the Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network and also the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach. And I'll show you where you can find those three submissions, and I think there's printouts today of the UMCN one. But those three submissions have a lot of really handy information in them, and they're not that long. So if you need to get your head around a few of the things we're trying to raise, because all three raise slightly different things, but they all complement each other really well. And the final one is we attended the consultation on the New South Wales Unregulated Water Sharing Plan, which the significance of that is the document that protects environmental water. So that's the reason why we've gone to that one is, hang on, let's try and get some things started, protect environmental water that's meant to be for the environment, so it can't just be taken out at the first pumps, and that's the mechanisms to do that. So we attended that with, I think, the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach and a couple of other scientists. This is the most basic slide I think I've ever made, but I've made it for a reason, as I'm trying to understand and try to communicate a couple of key different documents and how they sort of fit into the picture. And I'm really open to other ways to communicate this, but I'll try and work through this. So in the orange there, we have some of the New South Wales legislation and instruments that we want to keep an eye on. In the centre, we've got the green. They're the instruments that govern Snowy Hydro operations. And then in the blue here, we have the Commonwealth, the recent Commonwealth reforms, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, the Water Act in 2007, and the water resource plans that sit underneath that. Okay, I'll start with the Commonwealth stuff first. Okay, so the Water Act in 2007, it says, okay, here's how we're going to reform the Murray-Darling Basin, but any structures that are owned by Snowy Hydro will sit outside that. So from the start, apologies to those online, you might not be able to see, but I've put that arrow in there to say the Commonwealth Water Act sort of goes, okay, there's already rules in place for this part of the world. Let's leave them as they are, and we'll reform the rest of the Murray-Darling Basin. So the basin plan that sits underneath that can't make any rules that are inconsistent with those instruments I've circled in sort of red there. And that's why the Commonwealth reforms have sort of said, hey, there's already rules here, let's leave them as they are. Nothing in the new reforms can be inconsistent with that. So that Snowy Water Licence, that really is a really key document for us to focus on. And that's just been reviewed, and the review was pretty constrained. And so that's up for a review. It gets reviewed every 10 years, and so the next one is 2027. But that's a really key document that we can help fix a lot of the things I sort of pointed out at the start. The amount of water available, the rules around its use, how much the Upper Murrumbidgee gets. The second one is probably one of the worst named documents that I like to say in front of an audience, the Snowy Water Inquiry Outcomes Implementation Deed, or the SWIOID. And that is another really significant document because that governs some of the rules around environmental water use and is also part of the Snowy licence of how they operate. Now that was agreed to in 2002 and hasn't been reviewed since. And that question only came up in the New South Wales government, I reckon, 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago at their Senate estimates. They said, have you ever reviewed that SWIOID? And the answer was no. And then they said, well, do you think it needs to be updated? And the answer was no. So it's not going to happen unless we say, hang on, this was agreed to in 2002. Since then, we've had a Water Act, we've had a basin plan, we've learned a lot in the rest of the Murray-Darling Basin about how we can better care for our rivers. How about we crack this open and see what we can do better? Because at the moment it's 15 years out of date. So that's a really important document and that can be reviewed. It just needs the political will to do it. It can be reviewed at any time. Down the bottom here, this is a really obscure document that I can't even believe we found, to be honest. It's called the Snowy Hydro Limited Statement of Expectations. Now that's a statement from the shareholders to Snowy Hydro about their expectations on operations. And that comes from the two shareholders, the Federal Minister for Finance, Katie Gallagher, and the Minister for Energy, Chris Bowen. So they're the two shareholders. And now that we've got a new government, so the previous statement was made by Simon Birmingham and Angus Taylor in 2021. Now with a new government, new shareholders, an opportunity for them to outline their expectations of what they expect of Snowy. Maybe we can start to talk about things like environmental outcomes, cultural outcomes, social outcomes from the waterways that they help manage, even if it's just to start to get them to think about it. Because the current statement of expectations is energy and money. And that's, you know, I don't want to come across anti-Snowy or too hard on Snowy because this is their operating environment. So this is the rules that they're operating within. So I'm actually keen to work with them to go, how can we change this to get win-wins? Because in other parts of the Murray-Darling Basin, we can grow crops, we can generate energy, we can look after the environment, we can look after communities, you know, we can work with First Nations to get cultural outcomes. We can do this in other parts of the basin, but we're not doing it up the top here. So I'm actually really keen to work with Snowy in this space. Just finally, in the orange, the couple of the New South Wales ones, and I touched on that water sharing plan before. That's significant because it protects environmental water once it's in the system. And then underneath that, it's kind of a light shade of orange because it's not really legislation and it's not really a legislative instrument, but it's still important. And that's their regional water strategy that they're developing at the moment. And that's what the UMCN submitted, made a submission on. And that's trying to come up with a strategy for the region over the next 20 or so years. I've got a couple of animations in here just to point out the opportunities, I think, so there might be 3. So I'll start with the first one. I said this is a pretty basic, bodgy slide. So a couple of the opportunities. One is trying to get a new statement of expectations and trying to influence that with those two ministers as soon as possible. And that's where I think meeting with them directly, as well as meeting with our ACT reps and the shareholders in ICON as well to start to change those expectations about what we as a community expect from these operations. I also think the Federal Water Minister as well will have a really keen interest in this. The second one is sort of more of a watch. So we've made submissions on the water sharing plan and the regional water strategies. We've asked for environmental water to be protected. Let's see if it gets protected. We've asked in the regional water strategy, actually we've asked for a lot of things, you know, better interjurisdictional governance, working better with community and First Nations groups. And one of the options we put in our, sorry, I'll take a step back. The regional water strategy had, I think, 53 options that we had to comment on. Our submission from the Australian River Restoration Centre suggested an additional, completely new option, and that was to review this SWEOID. So we just said, this is a really important part of this part of the world. We'd like that added as a new option. So I've added that. Let's just keep an eye on the outcomes of those two engagement processes because they're ongoing at the moment. Now, with the next one is, can we crack this SWEOID open in 2023? Can we actually start to do the groundwork this year to open that up to interrogation and open it up to the community to understand how it works and what we can and can't change in it? Not a let's review it but do it in-house. Let's open it up so we can all have a look at it because it's 20 years old and it needs to be looked at and it has implications for the Upper Murrumbidgee. Why am I looking at 2023? And it's the last animation on this slide, please. Is because the Commonwealth Water Act is then reviewed in 2024. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan is reviewed in 2026. And the Snowy Water Licence, and as I said, that's a really key one, is 2027. So we want to be really ready to go when those reviews come up to say, hang on, let's take the best practice and lessons learned from other parts of the water reforms and start to apply it as best we can in the Upper Murrumbidgee and, as I said, other rivers that are impacted by documents such as the SWEOID and the licence. The next steps, we've created a website to bring attention to this, and the website is called theforgottenriver.au. There's no .com in it, so we managed to pinch that domain name. And that website tries to bring together all this information so the community can actually start to look into it and go, how does this work? What are the issues? What are the solutions? So what we're trying to do now is start to promote that website, and speaking to you today is the start of that process. Also was on Landcare Radio yesterday and it was great to be able to start to share it with a broader audience. Starting to write to the Snowy shareholders and starting to write to our local politicians, because I think we are going to need that top-down influence through things like the Statement of Expectations. Engaging with other ministers, ACT ministers, ICON Water, really keen to continue working with ICON Water, particularly around regional water quality and security. But also, as I mentioned, Snowy Hydro, really keen to understand what pushes their operating environment, what can and can't they budge on, so we can try and get some win-wins early on, but also look longer term. And in that context as well, Snowy Hydro 2.0, what does the change to their whole system mean for potential opportunities to help care for the rivers a bit better? Keep an eye on those water sharing plan and the regional water strategy processes. And then, as I mentioned, if we can get a SWEOID review starting next year, even starting this year would be pretty ambitious, but as soon as possible, we can then start to build these lessons into the Water Act Review 2024, Basin Plan Review 26, and in the Snowy Water Licence 2027. So I think there's one more slide. This was just a summary to come back to sort of close out and say, what are we trying to do with all this again? One, get our environmental water protected when it is released. Make sure the regional water security is ensured as best as possible, and especially heading into a warming and drying climate. Increase the volume of environmental water we have at hand. Change the rules around how we can use that so we can reflect how we use it in other parts of the basin. Really keen for the community engagement to continue building, especially that interjurisdictional engagement. And I threw this one at the end because we put it in our submission, but a comprehensive long-term monitoring project that goes across New South Wales and ACT and looks at fauna, vegetation, water quality, a multidisciplinary long-term monitoring project. And these have been done in other parts of the Murray-Darling Basin. So I think the model's there, we just need the appetite and the funding to, and the ownership from an agency to drive it. I think that's my last slide. I was going to share, this was Point Hut, this was when it started to kick off in 2021. I was going to show the website briefly, but I'll come back up to the top. We've tried to keep it really simple. Current issues, proposed solutions, sign up for more information. But in amongst this, we've sort of tried to say why the Forgotten River, a bit about the catchment, some of the regulation, again, my brother Simon's photo, and then some of the implications. So we've tried to sort of take a few different pieces of information from those forums I mentioned earlier and start to say, well, what does it mean for these different themes? Because much of these align with things like objectives in the water management framework. I've got my own mug on there. I figure I better put my money where my mouth is and show what we're about. And then also we've had a couple of people, so Antia has also put in a quote, Shawan from the Australian River Restoration Centre, and also Mark Linterman's about native fish. So I'll just quickly, so then once you get to there, you sort of go to our proposed way forward. And we talk a bit about some of the things I've just outlined, trying to get that SWIOID open. So this is why I won't go too much into it because I've just covered a lot of the ground in my presentation, but I will just draw your attention to some of the steps. And there's Mark Linterman's. This is what can people do from here? Learn more about the issues, start the conversations, voice your concerns with your politicians, and also subscribe to stay up to date with the newsletter. I'm a little nervous about that at the moment because I'll be the one who's trying to keep everyone up to date. So I'll try and at the moment keep this network up to date at these kind of forums. But as we get more and more, that'll be a way of updating people on things like where's the water sharing plan process up to and things like that. Okay, final slide. And so one of the things we've tried to do on this page is pull together the whole heap of different information that's available. So we've got things like reports, news articles, relevant documents. A couple of these are really key. One of them, I think, is you'll find things in here like the Snowy Scientific Advisory in 2010 made recommendations that there wasn't enough environmental water, that it wasn't protected. The Sustainable Rivers Audit in 2008 said the fish are already in poor health. So we've tried to pull together some of these things that have been said now since 2008 to say, well, we've been saying these for over a decade now. How do we start to hold them to account? And that's where these submissions, so we've put all three submissions there. You can see the Australian River Restoration, Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network, and the demonstration reach. We've put all three of them there together so you can have a look at them one after another. And then the final ones, a few news articles, I'll let you, and then all those documents I've mentioned, things like the SWIOID, the Snowy Outcomes Implementation Deed. We've put links to them and we've tried to put a little explanation about why it's important and then also any opportunities we can see to change it. So I'll stop there because that's heaps, I think, for the presentation. And it's just a way for people to go and start to navigate this. So thanks very much.